You swore we needed time, Isolde whispered, her voice breaking over the roar of the banquet hall. From the shadowed balcony, she watched Edric Thornwald, the warrior king, the man who had claimed her soul in secret for 3 agonizing years, lift the hand of another woman, Lady Genevieve of Oakhaven. To my future queen, Edric's voice thundered, commanding the loyalty of 100 lords. The hall erupted in cheers. Isolde's nails dug into the stone balustrade until her fingertips bled. The alpha she had submitted to, the man who knew her deepest curse, was crowning a stranger. He raised his goblet, but before he drank, his piercing gray eyes flicked upward, locking directly onto hers. The wait was over. Now it was time to burn it down. The great hall of Thornwald Keep was a cavern of suffocating heat and blinding gold. Banners of crimson and iron gray hung from the rafters, rippling slightly from the heat of the massive roaring hearths. Down below, the lords of the realm feasted on roasted boar and spiced wine, their laughter echoing off the ancient stone like the barking of wild hounds. It was a celebration of unity, of peace finally brought to a kingdom that had bled for a decade. But to Isolde Ravenshire, it was a funeral. She stood hidden in the alcove of the upper gallery, wrapped tightly in a cloak of midnight blue. To the court, she was merely the solitary archivist, the last surviving bloodline of the cursed Ravenshire house, kept around to maintain the castle's sprawling, dust-choked library. They did not know the truth. They did not know that beneath the heavy layers of wool and the bitter scent of crushed hemlock she wore to mask her true nature, she was an Omega, and they certainly did not know she belonged to the king. Isolde's breath hitched as Edric stood from the high table. Even from a distance, his presence was overwhelming. He was a man carved from war, his broad shoulders draped in a pelt of black wolf, a jagged scar cutting across his jawline from a battle long won. His alpha aura, a heavy, dominant scent of petrichor, struck flint and pine, rolled over the crowd, commanding absolute silence without a single word. Beside him stood Lady Genevieve. She was devastatingly beautiful, with hair like spun sunlight and skin untouched by the harshness of the world. She was the daughter of the wealthiest lord in the south, a beta of impeccable breeding and boundless political value. 3 years, Isolde thought, the words a rhythmic, agonizing pulse in her temple. 3 years in the dark, 3 years of stolen touches in the catacombs, of whispered promises against my skin while the castle slept. She remembered the night Edric had returned from the siege of Blackwater. He had come to her chambers, covered in mud and blood, collapsing into her arms. "Only you, Isolde," he had murmured into her hair, his massive frame shaking as he inhaled her natural scent, winter roses and wood smoke, which she only ever unmasked for him. When the crown is secure, there will be no more shadows. The crown was secure now, and yet here she stood in the dark. "My lords," Edric's voice resonated, rich and commanding. "Tonight, we forge an alliance that will ensure Thornwald never starves, never bleeds, and never falls. Lady Genevieve has honored me with her hand." The cheer that went up rattled the glass in the high windows. Isolde felt a physical tearing in her chest, a violent severing of the invisible tether that bound her Omega soul to his. It was a rejection so profound, it made her knees buckle. She gripped the cold stone of the pillar, forcing herself to remain upright. She would not weep. A Ravenshire did not weep. Down at the high table, Edric raised Genevieve's hand to his lips. But as the crowd roared, his movements slowed. The muscle in his jaw feathered. Slowly, agonizingly, his gaze drifted away from his radiant bride and drifted up to the shadowed gallery. Even across the vast distance, his gray eyes found her. The sheer intensity of his stare struck Isolde like a physical blow. There was no apology in his eyes. There was only a terrifying, possessive darkness. He was an alpha claiming a mate before the world. Yet his eyes were locked on the secret he kept in the dark. Isolde didn't look away. She let all the pain, all the betrayal, and all the suppressed fury of her cursed blood rise to the surface. She raised her chin, a silent, defiant gesture, before she turned her back on the king and stepped away from the balcony, disappearing into the shadows of the keep. The east wing of Thornwald Keep was forbidden to most. It was here the Ravenshire legacy lay buried, a labyrinth of crumbling stone, forgotten texts, and whispered curses. It was also the only place Isolde could breathe. She slammed the heavy oak door of her bedchamber shut, the rusted iron latch falling into place with a hollow thud. Trembling, she walked to the wash basin and began scrubbing the hemlock oil from her neck and wrists. The harsh soap burned her skin, but she welcomed the pain. As the bitter scent washed away, her natural omega fragrance, sweet winter roses laced with the sharp, smoky tang of distress, flooded the small room. She moved to her ancient armoire, pulling out a heavy leather satchel. She didn't know where she would go. The wilderness beyond the castle walls was dangerous, swarming with rogue alphas and mercenaries. But staying here, watching Edric parade Genevieve through the halls, would kill her just as surely. A sudden, violent tremor rattled the wooden door. Isolde. His voice was low, laced with the unmistakable vibration of an alpha command. It bypassed her ears and settled heavily in her bones, urging her to submit, to open the door. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, fighting the biological instinct. "Go back to your feast, Your Grace," she called out, her voice remarkably steady despite the chaotic storm in her chest. "Open the door, Isolde, before I take it off its hinges." She knew he wasn't making an empty threat. With a sharp exhale, she crossed the room and unlatched the iron lock. Edric pushed inside, bringing the freezing night air and the overwhelming scent of pine and flint with him. He looked massive in the cramped space, still wearing his formal furs, his crown of black iron resting heavily on his brow. The moment he crossed the threshold, he stopped, his nostrils flaring as he took in her unmasked scent. His pupils blew wide, swallowing the gray of his irises. "You're distressed," he rasped, taking a sudden step toward her. The instinct to soothe his omega was warring with his iron control. Isolde took a step back, holding up a hand. "Do not touch me." Edric froze, his jaw locked. "I had to do it. You know the state of the eastern borders. Oakhaven's grain is the only thing that will keep the northern provinces from starving this winter." "I am not questioning your politics, Edric," Isolde said coldly, moving back to her satchel and shoving a bound tome inside. "You are a king. You did what you must for your people. I simply no longer wish to be a casualty of your reign." "You are not a casualty," he growled, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. He grabbed her wrist, not tight enough to bruise, but firm enough to halt her movements. "Nothing changes between us. Genevieve is a political necessity, a figurehead, my knights, my true loyalty, remain here. Isolde looked down at his large, calloused hand wrapped around her pale wrist, then brought her eyes to his. You want me to be your whore? Don't use that word, he snarled, a low rumble echoing in his chest. What else am I? She challenged, her voice rising, the heartbreak finally cracking her stoic facade. I am the cursed Ravenshire girl you visit in the dark. I am the Omega you hide because my bloodline is considered an abomination. For 3 years, you told me to wait. You told me you would find a way to break the council's edict against my family. I am working on it, Edric shouted, the alpha tone slipping out, making the very air in the room feel heavy. Do you think I wanted to stand there tonight? Do you think I want her in my bed? It doesn't matter what you want, Isolde shot back, yanking her arm free. You claimed her, and by doing so, you severed us. I will not stay in the shadows and watch you build a life in the sun. Edric stared at her, his chest heaving. He looked at the half-packed satchel on the bed, and a terrifyingly cold expression fell over his features. The desperate lover vanished, replaced entirely by the hardened warrior king. You are the archivist of Thornwald, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, absolute whisper. You are bound to this keep by royal decree. You will not leave, and if you try to run into the winter woods as an unbonded Omega, you will not survive a week. He stepped closer, leaning down until his lips were a breath from her ear. You are mine, Isolde, in the light or in the dark, and I will not let you go. He turned and strode out of the room, the heavy door slamming shut behind him, leaving Isolde trembling in the suffocating silence of her gilded cage. The morning air was sharp enough to cut glass. In the cobblestone courtyard of Thornwald, the royal hunting party was assembling. It was a tradition to honor a new alliance with a hunt in the Whispering Woods, a vast expanse of ancient timber that bordered the castle. Isolde sat stiffly atop a dappled gray mare, her fingers tightly gripping the leather reins. By royal decree, she had been summoned. As the keeper of the castle's lore and maps, Edric had insisted her presence was required to navigate the deeper trails. Isolde knew it was a punishment. It was Edric's way of forcing her out of her sanctuary, forcing her to watch. You must be Lady Isolde, a soft musical voice chimed. Isolde turned her head. Riding up beside her on a magnificent white stallion was Lady Genevieve. Up close, the southern lady was even more flawless. Her eyes were a striking, clear blue, observing Isolde with an intensity that belied her delicate appearance. I am Isolde Ravenshire, my lady, she replied, keeping her voice carefully neutral. She had reapplied the hemlock oil thick to her pulse points this morning. It burned, but it kept her scent entirely muted. Edric speaks highly of your knowledge of the keep, Genevieve said, smiling politely, though her eyes remained sharp, calculating. She glanced toward the front of the party, where Edric was speaking with his commander, mounted on his massive black destrier. He told me the Ravenshire family was burdened by a terrible history. A blood curse, was it not? Isolde stiffened. Old wives' tales, my lady. To keep the superstitious away from my library. Genevieve let out a light laugh, but leaned slightly closer. I am not a superstitious woman, Lady Isolde, but I am an observant one. And I observe that the king looks toward the back of his hunting party far more often than he looks to his side. Before Isolde could formulate a response to the veiled threat, the hunting horns blew. The party surged forward, plunging into the dense, snow-dusted tree line of the Whispering Woods. The ride was grueling, the terrain uneven and treacherous. Isolde stayed near the rear, watching Edric lead the charge. He was a master of the hunt, moving through the woods with predatory grace. As they descended into a steep ravine, the canopy above grew thick, blocking out the morning sun. The hounds, far ahead, suddenly began to bay frantically. Not the excited barks of a trail found, but the panicked yelps of fear. From the underbrush, a massive, corrupted boar erupted. It was thrice the size of a normal beast, its eyes milky white, its tusks coated in black, foul-smelling ichor. A beast blighted by the old magic of the woods. Chaos ignited. Horses reared and screamed. Genevieve's white stallion panicked, bucking violently. The southern lady lost her grip, tumbling hard into the frozen dirt, right into the path of the charging beast. "Genevieve!" shouted several lords, scrambling for their weapons. Isolde's own horse reared, throwing her backward. She hit the ground with a sickening thud. The wind knocked from her lungs. The impact shattered the small glass vial of hemlock oil she kept in her inner pocket. Instantly, a wave of pure, unfiltered omega distress flooded the clearing. It was a beacon, a screaming siren of vulnerability in the wild. At the front of the line, Edric whipped his head around. The scent hit him like a physical strike. His alpha instincts, honed by years of war, overrode every logical thought. Genevieve was screaming on the ground, the blighted boar mere yards away. But Edric didn't ride toward his future queen. With a roar that shook the trees, Edric kicked his destrier, tearing through the hunting party, his sword drawn. He bypassed Genevieve completely, his eyes locked entirely on the back of the ravine. He threw himself from his horse, sliding across the frost, and planted himself directly over Isolde's fallen body, raising his broadsword to defend her from a threat that hadn't even looked her way. Silence crashed over the ravine. The captain of the guard had already dispatched the boar near Genevieve, but no one was looking at the beast. Every lord, every guard, and Lady Genevieve herself slowly turned to stare at the warrior king, who stood with his chest heaving, his teeth bared, shielding the lowly archivist with his life, while his bride lay bleeding in the dirt. Genevieve slowly pushed herself off the ground, wiping mud from her cheek. Her blue eyes locked onto Edric, and then drifted to Isolde. The curse keeping Isolde hidden was broken, and the war for Thornwald had just truly begun. The silence in the ravine was absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. The only sound was the jagged, ragged breathing of the warrior king and the dying gurgle of the blighted boar a dozen yards away. Edric stood over Isolde, his broadsword gleaming with cold winter light. His chest heaved beneath his leather armor. The terrifying, pure alpha scent of petrichor and striking flint rolled off him in suffocating waves, aggressively pressing down on every lord, every guard, and every horse in the vicinity. It was a wordless command. Stay back. She is mine. On the frozen earth beneath him, Isolde lay paralyzed. The air was thick with the scent of her broken hemlock vial, but overpowering it was her true essence, the sweet, unmistakable fragrance of winter roses and wood smoke, now spiked with the sharp tang of sheer terror. An Omega's distress call. Slowly, the fog of battle lust cleared from Edric's gray eyes. He blinked, the rigid tension in his shoulders snapping as he looked from the terrified face of the archivist beneath him to the stunned, blood-splattered face of Lady Genevieve across the clearing. Lord Vance, Genevieve's uncle and the commander of the Oakhaven Vanguard, was the first to find his voice. "Your Grace," he breathed, his voice trembling with a mixture of shock and rising fury. "What is the meaning of this? You abandoned your betrothed to protect a librarian?" Vance stepped forward, but Edric unleashed a low, visceral snarl that echoed through the trees. It was not the sound of a king. It was the sound of a wolf defending its mate. Lord Vance froze in his tracks, the color draining from his face. Genevieve did not weep. She did not scream. She slowly accepted the hand of a guard, rising to her feet with immaculate, terrifying dignity. She brushed the dirt from her riding habit, her piercing blue eyes never leaving Edric. "It seems," Genevieve said, her voice carrying clearly through the frigid air, "the king's priorities are not exactly aligned with the kingdom's." She inhaled deeply, her nose wrinkling in aristocratic distaste. "And it seems the keep has been harboring a deception, an unbonded Omega masquerading as a Beta, a Ravenshire no less." Whispers erupted among the lords like a lit powder keg. An Omega, the cursed bloodline, bewitchment. Edric finally sheathed his sword, though his hand never left the hilt. He looked down at Isolde. The mask he had worn for 3 years was shattered into 1,000 irrecoverable pieces. There was no going back to the shadows now. He reached down, ignoring the collective gasp of his court, and hauled Isolde to her feet. "Are you injured?" he asked, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. "You fool!" Isolde hissed through her teeth, her entire body trembling. "You have ruined everything." "I kept you alive," he shot back, his grip tightening possessively on her waist. He turned to face his court, his posture radiating absolute authority, daring any man to challenge him. "The hunt is over," Edric commanded, his voice returning to the ironclad baritone of the warrior king. "We return to Thornwald immediately." "And the girl?" Lord Vance demanded, his hand resting on his own pommel. "She carries the Ravenshire blood. The council decreed her family's magic a blight, and now she reveals herself as a deceptive Omega, clearly using her nature to manipulate the crown." "The girl," Edric said, his eyes darkening to the color of a winter storm, "is under my direct protection. Any man who questions my judgment on this matter will answer to my blade." He did not let Isolde walk back to her dappled mare. Instead, he lifted her effortlessly, tossing her onto the saddle of his massive black destrier before vaulting up behind her. He wrapped one massive arm around her waist, trapping her against his chest, shielding her exposed scent with his heavy furs. The ride back to the keep was agonizing. Isolde kept her eyes fixed firmly on the destrier's black mane, refusing to look at the furious lords or the icy, calculating stare of Lady Genevieve. She could feel the steady, thumping heartbeat of the alpha behind her, a steady rhythm that felt less like comfort and more like the ticking clock of her execution. When the massive iron gates of Thornwald closed behind them, Edric did not order her back to the dusty east wing. Instead, he carried her past the bewildered servants, past the whispering guards, and up the grand staircase. He marched directly into the royal pavilion, his personal chambers, and set her down, and, before she could speak, he walked out, locking the heavy oaken doors from the outside. The hollow thud of the deadbolt felt like the final nail in her coffin. She was no longer a secret. She was a prisoner. For 3 hours, Isolde paced the length of the king's solar. The room was opulent, drowning in rich crimson tapestries and the ever-present scent of Edric. It made her stomach churn. Every corner of the room screamed of his dominance, his authority, and his unyielding grip on her life. She had tried the doors, locked. She had looked out the arched windows, a 60-foot drop to the jagged rocks of the moat. She was trapped. When the heavy deadbolt finally slid back with a metallic screech, Isolde spun around, expecting Edric. Instead, the heavy doors pushed open to reveal Lady Genevieve, flanked by 2 heavily armed Oakhaven guards. Genevieve stepped into the room, her gaze sweeping over the king's private chambers before settling coldly on Isolde. She waved a hand dismissively. "Wait outside," she told the guards. "And close the door." "My lady," one guard protested. "The king ordered—" "The king is currently in the Great Hall, screaming at my uncle to keep the alliance from crumbling," Genevieve interrupted, her voice snapping like a whip. "Close. The door." The guards obeyed. The heavy oak shut, leaving the 2 women alone. Isolde stood her ground. She did not bow. She did not lower her eyes. The hemlock was gone, her omega scent filling the room, but she refused to project submission. "Have you come to inspect the damage, Lady Genevieve?" Genevieve walked slowly toward the roaring hearth, holding her pale hands out to the flames. Without the court watching, the polite, delicate facade she had worn earlier completely vanished. Her shoulders straightened, and her blue eyes sharpened into something predatory and deeply intelligent. "I am not a fool, Isolde," Genevieve said quietly, her tone conversational but laced with steel. "When Edric came to Oakhaven to negotiate this marriage, I knew he carried a ghost with him. Alphas are simple creatures, truly. They are territorial. They leave their marks. Edric looked at his kingdom like he owned it, but he looked at the shadows like he left his soul in them." She turned to face Isolde. "I simply did not expect the ghost to be the supposedly barren, cursed archivist, an omega hiding in plain sight. It is quite a brilliant deception." "How long?" 3 years, Isolde answered evenly. Genevieve's perfectly sculpted eyebrow twitched. 3 years. You have held the leash of the most ruthless warlord in the realm for 3 years, and yet you let him agree to marry me. Why? "I hold no leash," Isolde said bitterly, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "He is the king. I am a convenience, a secret he kept in the dark because my bloodline is politically radioactive." "A convenience?" Genevieve let out a sharp, genuine laugh. "He threw away an alliance that provides 50,000 bushels of wheat to shield your body from a beast that wasn't even looking at you. That is not convenience, Isolde. That is an obsession." Genevieve paced slowly around the heavy mahogany desk. "My uncle wants you burned as a witch. The northern lords believe you have used Ravenshire blood magic to ensnare the king's mind. They will demand your head by morning." A cold spike of genuine fear drove itself into Isolde's chest, but she kept her chin high. "And what do you want, Genevieve?" Genevieve stopped, resting her hands flat on the desk. "I want the crown. I have been groomed since birth to rule. Oakhaven needs the iron of Thornwald's army, and Thornwald needs my father's grain. That does not change simply because the king has a pet he cannot keep his hands off of." The insult stung, but Isolde saw the brutal pragmatism behind it. "Here is the reality of your situation," Genevieve continued, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The council will never accept you as queen. You are an omega, biologically wired to submit, and your family name is synonymous with treason and dark magic. If Edric tries to elevate you, the realm will tear itself apart in civil war. Thousands will die. Genevieve took a step closer. I will marry him. I will wear the crown. I will bear his legitimate heirs. In exchange, I will pacify my uncle and the council. I will allow Edric to keep you here, in these rooms, as his official concubine. You will be safe, you will be hidden, and Oakhaven will not starve the north. Isolde stared at the beautiful, terrifying woman before her. Genevieve wasn't offering mercy. She was offering a gilded cage. She was offering to formalize Isolde's degradation in exchange for political stability. You expect me to live as a kept secret, Isolde whispered, the sheer audacity of the proposal making her blood boil. To listen to you rule the kingdom while I wait for him to visit me in the night? I expect you to survive, Genevieve countered coldly. If you refuse this arrangement, if you try to take my place at his side, I will write to my father tonight. The grain shipments will stop, the alliance will die, and Edric will have to choose between keeping you or watching his people starve to death in the snow. Which do you think the warrior king will choose when the hunger riots begin? Genevieve didn't wait for an answer. She turned and swept toward the door, her skirts rustling like dry leaves. You have until sunset to convince him to take my deal, Omega, or I will break you both. The door locked again, leaving Isolde in the suffocating silence of Edric's chambers. Genevieve's words echoed in her mind, a venomous truth that she could not deny. Which will he choose when his people starve? He would choose his kingdom. He always did. He had chosen Genevieve to secure the borders. He would choose to lock Isolde in this room to secure his conscience. I will not be a concubine, Isolde whispered to the empty room. I will not be a casualty. She walked to the massive stone fireplace. Above the mantel hung a ceremonial shield, but Isolde wasn't interested in the weaponry. She reached up, running her fingers along the ornate stonework until she found a specific indentation, a crest shaped like a raven in flight. She pressed hard. With a soft grind of stone on stone, the back of the fireplace shifted, revealing a narrow, pitch-black passageway. Thornwald Keep had not been built by Edric's ancestors. It had been built by hers. The Ravenshires were the original architects of the fortress, long before they were overthrown and branded as cursed. For 3 years, Isolde had used these hidden veins to visit Edric in secret. Now she would use them to escape him. She slipped into the darkness, grabbing a heavy iron candlestick to light her way. The air in the walls was freezing, smelling of ancient dust and damp earth. She descended rapidly, bypassing the guarded corridors, moving deeper and deeper until the sounds of the castle faded into a sepulchral silence. She emerged in the deepest part of the east wing, the restricted catacombs beneath the library. This was the true heart of the Ravenshire legacy. Massive stone pillars carved with runic script held up the cavernous ceiling. In the center of the room sat a massive altar of black obsidian, untouched for centuries. The curse the council feared was not demonic witchcraft. It was earth magic, blood magic, a tether between the sovereign and the land itself, dormant since the last Ravenshire was slaughtered. Isolde approached the altar. She had spent her life suppressing her blood, masking her scent, hiding her power to survive in a world ruled by alphas. But survival was no longer enough. You should not have left the royal wing. The voice boomed through the cavern, vibrating off the stone. Isolde spun around. Edric stood at the entrance of the catacombs, a torch in his hand, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying fury. He had tracked her. His alpha senses were entirely attuned to her scent. Now that the hemlock was gone, he threw the torch into a wall sconce and marched toward her, his heavy boots echoing like thunder. "Do you have any idea what is happening above?" he snarled, closing the distance rapidly. "The council is in an uproar. Vance is threatening to march his vanguard back south. I have guards stationed at every door to keep you safe, and you crawl into the walls like a rat." "Safe?" Isolde echoed, her voice trembling not with fear, but with rage. "You call locking me in your bedroom safety?" "I call it keeping your head on your shoulders," Edric roared, stopping just feet from her. His alpha aura flared, a heavy, crushing weight designed to force an omega to her knees. Isolde felt her legs tremble, the biological urge to submit screaming in her veins, but she gripped the edge of the obsidian altar, forcing herself to stand tall. "Genevieve came to see me," Isolde said, her voice piercing through his anger. "She offered me a place as your official whore. She promised to secure your borders if you agreed to keep me locked away in the dark forever." Edric flinched, the muscle in his jaw feathering. "I would never let them treat you as a whore." "Then what am I, Edric?" Isolde screamed, her voice cracking. "I am not your queen. I am an omega hiding in the ruins of my ancestors' home. You claim you want me, but you will not fight for me. You just want to possess me." "I am fighting for my kingdom," Edric yelled back, stepping forward and grabbing her by the shoulders. His grip was desperate, trembling with suppressed emotion. "If I denounce the marriage, Oakhaven attacks. If I legitimize you, my own lords will rebel. I am trying to keep you alive, Isolde. I cannot lose you." "You already have," she whispered, tears finally spilling over her lashes, hot and bitter. Edric's expression shattered. He pulled her flush against his chest, burying his face in her neck, inhaling her scent desperately. No, I will not accept that. You are mine." He tried to use his command, pouring his dominant will into his voice. "Submit, Isolde." It was a command that had always broken her defenses in the past. But as the heavy vibration hit her, Isolde reached behind her, her fingers finding a jagged ceremonial obsidian dagger resting on the altar. "The council fears the Ravenshire blood," Isolde whispered into his ear. "They call it a curse. They say we use dark magic to rule." She pulled the dagger forward, pressing the razor-sharp edge directly into the palm of her left hand. Edric pulled back, his eyes widening in horror as he saw the blade. "Isolde, stop!" "They were right to fear it," she said, her eyes flashing with a sudden, unnatural silver light. She slashed the blade across her palm. Blood, dark and rich, welled up instantly. Before Edric could stop her, she slammed her bleeding, scarred hand down onto the center of the obsidian altar. The reaction was instantaneous. A shock wave of pure, kinetic energy erupted from the stone, throwing Edric backward off his feet. The catacombs rumbled violently, dust cascading from the ceiling. The ancient runes carved into the pillars ignited with a blinding, ethereal blue fire. The air pressure plummeted. Isolde stood at the altar, her hair whipping around her face from an unseen wind. Her omega scent of winter roses suddenly mutated, laced with the terrifying scent of ozone, burning earth, and raw, untamed power. Edric pushed himself up onto one knee, staring at the woman he thought he knew, the woman he thought he could control. Isolde looked down at him, the blue light reflecting in her eyes. "I am done waiting in the shadows, Your Grace. If you will not secure my place in this kingdom, I will claim it myself." The catacombs of Thornwald vibrated with a frequency that rattled the marrow in Edric's bones. The ethereal blue fire tracing the ancient runic pillars cast long, dancing shadows across the cavern, illuminating the dust that rained from the trembling ceiling. Isolde remained at the obsidian altar, her bleeding palm pressed flat against the stone. She did not look like the quiet, submissive archivist who had hidden in the library for 3 years. She did not look like the trembling Omega he had shielded in the woods. Her eyes were entirely silver, glowing with an inner, terrible luminescence. The scent of winter roses had deepened, intertwining with the sharp, crackling tang of a looming thunderstorm. It was an Omega scent, yes, but it carried an authority that pressed against Edric's alpha biology, forcing him to fight the instinct to lower his eyes. "Isolde!" Edric ground out, his voice fighting the roar of the awakening stone. He forced himself upright, his heavy boots scraping against the trembling floor. "Break the connection. If the council feels this, let them feel it," Isolde's voice echoed, layered with a resonant, metallic harmonic that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "For a century, my ancestors' magic was called a blight because the usurpers could not control it. They branded us a curse because the earth itself rejected them." She slowly lifted her hand from the altar. The wound on her palm was already knitting together, sealed by the raw kinetic energy surging through her veins. Edric took a step toward her, his alpha dominance surging out as a defensive mechanism. He projected a heavy, suffocating aura of flint and petrichor, an invisible weight designed to subdue. "You are an Omega. You cannot wield the Keep's core. It will tear your mind apart. Submit to me, Isolde, and let me help you." For the first time in 3 years, the command completely failed. Isolde did not drop to her knees. She did not bare her neck. Instead, she turned her glowing silver eyes upon him, and the heavy, crushing weight of his alpha aura simply dissolved, evaporating like mist over a volcano. Edric stopped dead. A cold shock of disbelief washed over him. His biology, the very essence of his power as a ruling alpha, was entirely useless against her. "I have submitted to you for 3 years in the dark," Isolde said softly, the magical resonance in her voice fading to a terrifying, deadly calm. "I let you believe you were protecting me, but you were only protecting your own reign. You locked me away because you feared what the world would do to an Omega. You never considered what this Omega could do to the world." She stepped away from the altar. As she moved, the heavy stone floor beneath her boots seemed to sigh, the vibrations settling into a steady, rhythmic pulse that matched her heartbeat. "What are you doing?" Edric asked, a rare thread of genuine uncertainty weaving into his tone. He reached for his broadsword out of pure muscle memory, though he knew steel was useless here. "Genevieve gave me until sunset to accept my place as your hidden whore," Isolde said, walking past him toward the dark corridor leading up to the keep. She didn't even flinch at his proximity. "I am going to give the council my answer." Edric spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Isolde, wait! Vance has 100 men in the courtyard. They will slaughter you before you reach the great hall." Isolde paused at the threshold of the darkness. She glanced over her shoulder, the blue light catching the sharp, defiant angle of her jaw. "Let them try, Your Grace," she whispered. "This is my house." She stepped into the black corridor, and as she did, the ancient iron torches lining the walls burst into spontaneous blue flame, lighting her path to the surface. Edric stared for a fraction of a second before he swore violently and sprinted after her. No longer the king leading his kingdom, but a man desperately chasing a storm. Great Hall was a powder keg of shouting lords and clashing steel. The grand oak tables had been pushed aside, and the northern lords of Thornwald stood in a tense, furious standoff with the southern vanguard of Oakhaven. Lord Vance, his face mottled red with rage, slammed his fist onto the high table. "The king is compromised. He abandons my niece, the future queen, to throw his body over a diseased Ravenshire. She is using witchcraft to blind him, and I demand the girl be brought before the council and burned." Sitting calmly in the high seat beside the empty king's throne was Lady Genevieve. She sipped from a silver goblet, her expression perfectly composed. She had played her hand. Edric was cornered. By nightfall, the Omega would be locked away, and her crown would be secured. "My uncle speaks harshly," Genevieve said, her voice cutting through the din. "But he speaks the truth. Thornwald cannot afford an erratic king. We must—" A low subterranean rumble cut her off. The wine in Genevieve's goblet trembled. The heavy iron chandeliers swinging from the rafters began to sway, their chains groaning in protest. Silence crashed over the great hall as the lords drew their weapons, looking wildly around the room. "Earthquake?" a northern lord muttered, gripping his sword. Then, the massive 12-foot oak doors of the great hall, doors that required 4 strong men to push open, violently blasted inward. They hit the stone walls with a deafening crack, splintering at the hinges. The freezing winter wind howled into the hall, blowing out the hearth fires in an instant. In their place, the torches lining the walls ignited with a blinding, ethereal blue fire. Through the shattered doorway walked Isolde. She wore no crown, no armor, only the simple wool dress of an archivist, but the air around her warped with raw kinetic pressure. Her eyes were pools of liquid silver. Behind her, Edric stepped into the hall, his hand resting on his sword hilt, but he did not step in front of her. For the first time in his reign, the warrior king walked in a woman's shadow. "Witch!" Lord Vance screamed, drawing his broadsword. "The Ravenshire whore has bewitched the king. Guards, take her head." A dozen Oakhaven guards surged forward, their armor clanking as they raised their spears. Isolde did not flinch. She simply raised her hand. The stone floor of the great hall violently buckled. The flagstones beneath the charging guards violently shifted, rising and falling like a tempestuous ocean. The guards screamed, losing their footing and crashing to the floor in a tangled mass of steel and limbs. The stone smoothed itself out just as quickly, trapping their spears and boots beneath solid rock, anchoring them to the ground without shedding a single drop of blood. The entire hall froze in absolute breathless terror. Isolde lowered her hand, her silver eyes locking onto Lady Genevieve, who had finally dropped her goblet, her perfect composure fracturing into genuine horror. "You offered me a cage, Lady Genevieve," Isolde's voice echoed, the magical resonance vibrating in the chests of every man present. It was not a shout, but it commanded absolute silence. "You offered me my life in exchange for my dignity. You told me I was biologically wired to submit." Isolde took a slow, deliberate step toward the high table. The alpha lords in the room, Men who had won countless wars instinctively backed away, their biology screaming at them to submit to the overwhelming terrestrial power radiating from the Omega. "I am a Ravenshire," Isolde declared, the blue fire in the torches flaring with her words. "My blood is the mortar of this keep. My heartbeat is the pulse of these lands. You sit in my hall, drinking my wine, and you dare demand my execution." Lord Vance, trembling violently, looked at Edric. "Your Grace, do something. She is a monster." Every eye in the hall shifted to the warrior king. This was the moment. The realm held its breath, waiting to see if Edric would fight the magic, or if he would finally choose the woman over the crown. Edric looked at the terrified lords, then at Genevieve, and finally at Isolde. He saw the terrible, beautiful power she wielded, and he saw the 3 years of pain he had forced her to endure. Slowly, deliberately, Edric unbuckled his sword belt. The heavy weapon hit the stone floor with a resounding clang. "The lady has spoken," Edric said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried no alpha command, only absolute conviction. He walked forward, stopping beside Isolde, and turned to face the council. "Thornwald does not belong to me. It belongs to her. And so do I." Genevieve stared at the heavy broadsword resting on the stone floor. Her keen political mind raced, calculating odds, trying to find a loophole in the disaster unfolding before her. But there was no logic to fight the earth itself. "You are throwing away your kingdom," Genevieve whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Oakhaven will cut off the grain. Your northern provinces will starve. You cannot eat magic, Edric." Isolde turned her silver gaze to the southern lady. "The blight on the northern fields was not a natural famine, Genevieve. It was the land rotting because it was severed from its true anchor. The magic you fear is the very lifeblood of the soil. By spring, the northern fields will yield harvests Thornwald has not seen in a century. We do not need your grain." Genevieve blanched. She looked around the hall, seeing the awe and terror in the eyes of the northern lords. They were a superstitious people, seeing the ancient magic restored, seeing the king willingly yield to it. They would follow Isolde. Oakhaven had lost its leverage entirely. With immense effort, Genevieve smoothed the front of her dress and raised her chin, preserving the last scraps of her pride. "Then there is nothing more to discuss. Come, uncle. We ride for the south. I will not sleep another night in a castle possessed." Lord Vance looked like he wanted to argue, but a low rumble from the floor beneath his boots changed his mind. He spat on the ground and ordered his men to free themselves. Within minutes, the Oakhaven vanguard was retreating, their footsteps echoing hollowly as they fled the great hall. The northern lords remained, dropping to one knee, a wave of submission sweeping through the room. They bowed not to Edric, but to the glowing, terrible power of the Omega, who stood at the center of the hall. Isolde closed her eyes. She let out a long, shuddering breath. The silver luminescence slowly faded from her irises, leaving them a soft, exhausted brown. The blue fire in the torches shifted back to the warm orange glow of natural flame. The crushing pressure in the air dissipated, replaced once more by the sweet scent of winter roses. The magic receded, leaving her entirely human and entirely drained. Her knees buckled. Edric caught her before she hit the stone. His massive arms wrapped around her, pulling her tightly against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling her true scent without hesitation, without hiding it. "I've got you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I've got you." Isolde rested her forehead against his leather armor, her hands weakly gripping his tunic. "You gave up the alliance. You gave up your absolute rule." "It was never mine to begin with," Edric replied softly, his alpha aura returning. But this time, it was not a heavy, dominant weight. It was a warm, protective blanket wrapping around her, soothing her frayed nerves. "I was a fool, Isolde. I thought I had to conquer the world to keep you safe. I didn't realize you were the one who held the world together." He pulled back slightly, looking down into her tired eyes. The warrior king, a man who had commanded thousands and broken kingdoms, slowly sank to one knee on the hard stone floor. He took her scarred, blood-stained hand, the hand that had awakened the castle, and pressed it to his lips. "No more shadows," Edric swore, his gray eyes shining with fierce, unbreakable devotion. "No more secrets. You are my mate. You are the true queen of Thornwald, and I will spend the rest of my days earning the right to stand beside you in the light." Isolde looked down at the alpha who had finally learned how to yield. A small, genuine smile broke through the exhaustion on her face. She stepped forward, her fingers threading into his dark hair, and for the first time in 3 years, she did not wait for him in the dark. She pulled him up to meet her in the light. Chapter 9 wraps the narrative. Genevieve's exit is pragmatic, fitting her character. The explanation of the blight resolves the political tension, the need for grain. The most important moment is the ending, the physical manifestation of Edric kneeling. It visualizes the shift in their alpha-omega dynamic, ending the story on a note of equality and true partnership. The secret was broken, the curse was lifted, and the warrior king finally learned that true power wasn't found in a crown, but in the heart of the Omega, who ruled the very earth beneath his feet. Isolde and Edric's story reminds us that sometimes the shadows we are forced into become the very places we find the strength to conquer the light. Did Isolde's magical awakening give you chills? Do you think Genevieve will plot revenge from the south? Or has she truly accepted defeat? If you loved this dramatic tale of hidden power, fierce romance, and breaking the rules of the Omegaverse, please hit that like button. Share this story with your fellow fantasy romance lovers, and don't forget to subscribe for more epic, pulse-pounding, original fiction. Let me know your favorite moment in the comments below.